Before you imagine glowing domes, lunar streets, and a giant SpaceX city rising out of the dust, picture the very first heavy ship dropping onto the moon. Not the rocket, the ground. Because on the moon, the ground may be the first thing that tries to kill the dream. Lunar dust is not like the dirt outside your house. NASA describes it as sharp, abrasive, and electrostatically clingy, more like tiny shards of glass than soft powder. It can get into seals, hatches, instruments, habitats, and hardware. NASA has even been testing active dust-repelling technology on the moon itself, because this is serious enough to threaten long-term lunar operations. And that is the first thing most Moon City fantasies get wrong. They make the hard part sound like getting there. But getting there is only the beginning. Because a city is not a landing. A city is not a press release. A city is not even a habitat. A city is something that survives repeated landings, repeated failures, repeated repairs, repeated exposure, and all the slow, boring damage that turns a bold vision into maintenance. That is the real moon question. Not, can SpaceX reach the moon? Can anything city-like stay alive there long enough to deserve the word city? Now, to be fair, this idea did not appear out of nowhere. Elon Musk recently said SpaceX is prioritizing a self-growing city on the moon before Mars, arguing that the moon is closer, easier to reach, and more practical as a first off-world foothold. And on paper, that logic is not crazy. NASA is already working with SpaceX on Starship HLS for Artemis, and before astronauts use it, NASA requires an uncrewed lunar landing demonstration. In other words, the moon is not just sci-fi anymore. It is a real engineering target. That is exactly why this gets interesting. Because the moon is close enough to feel familiar. Close enough to tempt us into thinking it is just a harder version of Earth. But it is not. It is a place with no breathable air, no weather to smooth or soften the surface, extreme temperature swings, dangerous radiation exposure, and dust that does not politely stay on the ground. NASA and NASA-backed technical work on lunar habitats and shielding treat radiation protection and regolith shielding as major design concerns, not optional upgrades. So, the real story is not how futuristic a moon city sounds. The real story is how quickly that clean, futuristic picture starts to fall apart when you ask what the moon would actually do to it. Start with dust. From orbit, the moon looks dead calm, grey, still, almost simple. But if you zoom down to the surface, simplicity disappears. Apollo astronauts already reported how invasive lunar dust was. It clung to suits, scratched surfaces, and got everywhere. Modern NASA dust mitigation work exists because that old problem never went away. The moon has no wind, no rain, no rivers, no biology, no soft weathering. So those particles stay jagged. They do not get rounded off the way Earth dust does. That means the moon is covered in material that is not just annoying, it is mechanically unfriendly. Think about what that means in plain English. Solar panels, camera lenses, suit joined, air seals, radiators, bearings, hinges, moving robot parts. On Earth, cities survive because the environment is hard but familiar. We know how to seal, clean, lubricate, replace, and protect. On the moon, even the dust behaves differently enough that it can force new rules for almost everything. And this is where the Moon City fantasy gets even weaker. Because the dust problem is not just sitting there waiting, your own landings can make it worse. That matters because a Moon City is not one mission. It is not one heroic touchdown, one flag, one habitat, one beautiful render. A city means repeated arrivals, cargo, spare parts, power systems, surface vehicles, construction equipment, replacement equipment for the equipment that failed. NASA's own lunar architecture reflects this larger systems view. Human landing is only one part of sustained surface operations, which also include mobility, power, habitats, and logistics. So imagine it. The first giant vehicle lands, then another, then another. Every arrival is progress, but every arrival is also an environmental event. Because the act of landing on the moon is not like parking at a warehouse. It is more like kicking up a storm made of abrasive grit around the very place where your future city is supposed to become more delicate, more inhabited, and more complex. That is the contradiction at the center of the whole dream. The more you build, the more your operations have to become careful. But the more you expand, the more operations you need. So before you even get to city, you may need landing pads, protected zones, berms, separation distances, dust control, and a layout designed around the fact that your own transportation system can become part of the hazard. Which means the first big reveal is this: a moon city is not mainly an architecture problem, it is an environmental control problem. And once you see that, the next clean fantasy breaks too. The idea that a landed ship is basically already a habitat. Because, no, not really. A starship hull on the moon would be a shell. A very important shell. Maybe even a revolutionary one. NASA's Starship HLS material makes clear that it is a massive lunar lander concept with crew and cargo capability. But a shell is not the same thing as a settlement. If you were living there, you would not care how beautiful the render looked from orbit. You would care about what stands between your body and radiation, what keeps the temperature manageable, what stops dust from entering life support systems, what protects equipment from the slow grind of exposure, what keeps a bad seal from becoming a fatal problem. This is why lunar habitat research keeps circling back to shielding, materials, and regolith. NASA technical work has looked at thick regolith shielding and habitat materials because surviving on the lunar surface is not just about having walls. It is about what those walls have to endure and how much extra protection has to be added around them. So the first real moon settlement may look a lot less like a city skyline and a lot more like something that is trying to hide from the moon. Buried modules, shielded corridors, protected work zones, robots operating outside more often than humans, infrastructure spaced out, not because it looks nice, but because the environment forces it. That is the version people do not picture when they hear the word city, but it may be the more honest version, because on the moon, shelter comes before skyline. And that brings us to the next misconception. People hear self-growing city and imagine scale, expansion, momentum, something that builds on itself. But cities do not grow because someone drops structures onto the ground. Cities grow because systems keep working. Power, repair, replacement, cleaning, movement, storage, redundancy. A city is a machine that can keep healing itself, and that may be the hardest part of all. It is one thing to land a dramatic piece of hardware. It is another thing to keep dozens of less glamorous systems functioning in a place where every failure can cascade. A power system is not just a power system. It is what keeps heat where it needs to be, keeps cold where it needs to stay out, keeps communications alive, keeps robots charged, keeps processing running, keeps life support from becoming a countdown. A vehicle is not just transportation. It is your ability to move tools, people, regolith, cables, spare parts, broken parts, and emergency supplies across a place where being stranded can become deadly very fast. A robot is not just labor. It is a force multiplier that may have to do dangerous, repetitive, dust-heavy work outside again and again, while the humans stay protected as much as possible. This is why the phrase "city on the moon" is both inspiring and misleading at the same time. Inspiring because it points to something civilization-sized. Misleading because it makes the first phase sound urban when it may actually be industrial, buried, sparse, and obsessed with survival. Less shiny lunar metropolis, more bunker port factory hybrid. Less boulevard, more protected node network. Less we built a city, more we built a system that hasn't died yet. And to be clear, that does not make the dream smaller. In a strange way, it makes it bigger. Because if humans actually learn to keep a functioning settlement alive on the moon, in that kind of environment, using local material where possible, protecting against dust, reducing radiation risk, and building reliable surface operations, that would be one of the biggest step changes in our species' history. NASA's Artemis effort is explicitly about building toward a long-term lunar presence, not just repeating Apollo-style visits. That is not just a base. That is learning how not to belong somewhere and survive anyway. And maybe that is the real meaning of this whole thing. The moon is close enough that our imagination keeps trying to domesticate it. We keep wanting it to be the easy one, the starter world, the nearby practice run, the first suburb of Earth. But the closer you look, the stranger it gets. The dust is wrong. The ground is wrong. The exposure is wrong. The maintenance burden is wrong. Even the word city starts to feel wrong, because the first real city on the moon may not look like a city at all. It may look like a place that spends every day fighting the moon and barely winning, and that is the part that makes this more fascinating than the glossy version. Because if the nearest other world already forces this much humility, what does that say about Mars? About the outer planets? About all those beautiful places in the universe that seem simple only because they are still far away? That may be the deepest payoff here. Not whether Musk is right on the timeline. Not whether one company gets there first, but that the universe keeps doing this to us. From a distance, it offers a clean picture. Then we move closer, measure more carefully, and the clean picture breaks. The moon is close enough to fool us into optimism, and alien enough to punish every shortcut. So yes, maybe one day SpaceX helps build something city-like on the moon. But if that day comes, it probably will not begin with towers, lights, and lunar neighborhoods. It will begin with dust control, shielding, distance between landing zones, robots doing dirty work, power systems that cannot fail, habitats that hide, and an endless war against a world that looks calm only from far away. Because the first moon city will not be defined by how futuristic it looks. It will be defined by whether it survives, and that is what makes the idea worth watching. Not because the moon is becoming Earth, but because it never will.